Imagine a city built for 1 million people, a city with wide multi-lane avenues, dozens of modern skyscrapers, new residential districts, shopping centers, museums, theaters, and even a fully developed public transportation system. Everything looks brand new, as if the city has just stepped out of architectural renderings and suddenly become reality. There are schools, parks, stadiums, metro stations, modern administrative buildings, and entire neighborhoods filled with apartment complexes. But when you begin driving through these streets or walking between the buildings, a strange feeling appears. Most of the windows are dark. There are almost no cars on the roads. In huge residential complexes, you can see thousands of apartments, yet most of them have no lights on inside. Shops are open inside the malls, but there are barely any visitors. It feels as if the city physically exists, yet for some reason, people never came to live there. That is why places like this are often called ghost cities. One of the most famous examples of this phenomenon is Ordos Kangbashi in Inner Mongolia. It is a modern urban district with futuristic architecture, large public squares, museums, and enormous residential neighborhoods. When it was first built, it looked like a fully completed city designed for hundreds of thousands of residents. But during the first years after construction finished, only a few thousand people actually lived there. Photos of empty avenues and deserted housing districts quickly spread around the world. For many analysts, it became a symbol of something unusual happening in China. The idea that the country was building cities that nobody actually needed. And this is not just about one city. Over the past few decades, China has built dozens of new urban districts and even entirely new cities that, at first glance, appear far too large for the number of people living there today. Some of them have metro systems, developed infrastructure, massive residential complexes, and business centers. Yet their population in the early years seems surprisingly small compared to the scale of construction. Because of this, a narrative emerged in international media claiming that China was building so-called ghost cities, entire urban areas that stand almost empty. At first glance, it really does look like an economic paradox. Building a modern city is one of the most expensive infrastructure projects any country can undertake. It is not just about constructing residential buildings. You need roads, bridges, subway systems, electrical grids, water supply networks, hospitals, schools, administrative buildings, and dozens of other systems without which a city simply cannot function. All of this requires enormous investments, huge quantities of materials, and years of work by thousands of engineers, architects, and construction workers. That is why, for many people, the idea that a country might spend such vast resources on building cities that appear almost empty seems completely illogical. And this is where the central question emerges. Why does one of the world's largest economies continue building massive new cities, even when they appear half empty? Is this really an economic mistake, the result of a construction bubble? Or is there a much more complex logic behind this strategy, a long-term approach by a country trying to prepare for the future? To understand the answer, we need to look at what has actually been happening to China's population and its cities over the last 40 years. And this is exactly where the story of China's ghost cities begins to look very different from what it seems at first glance. To understand why cities in China sometimes appear almost empty in their early years, we need to look at one of the largest social transformations in human history, the urbanization of China. For most of its history, China was primarily an agricultural country. As recently as 1980, only about 1/5 of the population lived in cities, while the vast majority lived in rural areas, working in agriculture or in small local economies. Cities certainly existed, but their role in the structure of the economy was far smaller than it is today. However, with the beginning of economic reforms in the late 20th century, the situation began to change at an unprecedented speed. China gradually transformed from an agricultural economy into an industrial one, and later into a technological powerhouse. This meant that millions of new jobs began appearing in cities, in factories, logistics centers, financial institutions, technology companies, and the service sector. As a result, enormous numbers of people began moving from rural regions into urban centers in search of work, higher incomes, and better living conditions. The scale of this process is difficult to fully imagine. Over just a few decades, China experienced the largest wave of urbanization in human history. Hundreds of millions of people changed where they lived, moving into cities. In 1980, the country's urbanization rate was roughly 20%. Today, it exceeds 65% and continues to grow. That means that within a relatively short historical period, the urban population of China increased by hundreds of millions of people. For comparison, that is more than the entire population of many large countries combined. When a country faces a transformation on this scale, it encounters a fundamental infrastructure challenge. Every person moving to a city needs housing, transportation, hospitals, schools, electricity, water, and access to jobs. If cities are not prepared to absorb such a massive flow of people, the result can be chaotic settlements, overcrowded neighborhoods, and overloaded infrastructure. Exactly this kind of situation has appeared in many parts of the world where urbanization happened faster than cities were able to build the infrastructure required to support it. China chose a different approach. Instead of waiting until cities became overcrowded and only then reacting to the problem, the government decided to move ahead of the process. New cities, districts, and infrastructure projects began to be built in advance, long before large numbers of people started moving there. This meant creating residential neighborhoods, transportation systems, and social infrastructure ahead of time, so that when new residents eventually arrived, the city would already be prepared to accommodate them. This is exactly why some new Chinese cities can appear almost empty in their early stages. The infrastructure is already there, residential buildings are completed, roads are laid out, and public spaces are fully developed. But the population is only beginning to gradually fill these spaces. In many cases, the process of settlement can take years or even decades because relocating hundreds of thousands of people is a complex socio-economic process that does not happen overnight. That is also why photos of new Chinese districts with empty streets often create a misleading impression. They capture only a brief moment in the life cycle of a city, the moment between the completion of construction and the gradual arrival of residents. But if you look at those same places a few years later, the picture often changes dramatically. Districts that once appeared almost deserted begin to slowly fill with life. Shops open, traffic increases, schools fill with students, and residential neighborhoods gradually gain new inhabitants. And here, it is important to understand another distinctive feature of China's development model. In many countries, cities grow gradually and somewhat chaotically. First, people arrive, and only then does infrastructure begin to develop around them. In China, the process is often reversed. Infrastructure comes first. Roads, metro systems, residential districts, business centers. And only after that does the large-scale movement of people into these urban spaces begin. This is why some of these cities may initially appear strangely quiet and almost empty, even though they are actually part of a long-term strategy for urban development. Another important element of this story lies in how the economic system of urban development works in China. Unlike many Western countries, where urban growth often happens more gradually and largely through private initiatives, in China, local governments play a central role in planning cities. They determine where new districts will appear, which infrastructure projects will be implemented, and how specific territories will develop in the future. Land plays a crucial role in this system because formally, most urban land in China is owned by the state, and local governments generate a significant share of their revenue by selling land use rights to property developers. This mechanism works roughly like this. Local governments plan a new district or even an entirely new city, build the basic infrastructure, roads, bridges, transportation hubs, sometimes even metro systems, and then sell land use rights to developers who construct residential complexes, office buildings, and shopping centers. For local authorities, this becomes one of the main sources of revenue. The money generated from these land sales is then used to finance new infrastructure projects, social programs, and the continued development of urban areas. In this way, a kind of economic cycle emerges in which the construction of new districts becomes an important part of overall economic activity. This model also supports an enormous construction industry, which has become one of the key sectors of the Chinese economy. Building new cities creates demand for steel, cement, glass, electrical systems, transportation infrastructure, and thousands of other components. As a result, millions of people find employment in construction, logistics, material production, and related industries. That is why large-scale construction projects have played the role of one of the main engines of economic growth in China for many years. However, this model of development also carries certain risks. When construction becomes such an important part of the economy, there is always the danger that new projects will appear faster than real demand for housing develops. This is why some economists began to warn about the possibility of a real estate bubble in China. One of the most well-known examples of problems in this sector involved the developer Evergrande Group, which accumulated enormous debts while rapidly expanding its construction projects. When the company ran into financial difficulties, it raised concerns about the stability of the entire property market. Stories like this reinforce the arguments of those who believe that China may have built too much housing. In some regions, it is possible to find entire residential complexes where a significant share of apartments remained unsold for long periods of time or were used purely as investment assets. Investors would purchase properties expecting their value to rise, but they would not necessarily rent them out or move into them themselves. As a result, certain neighborhoods could appear unusually quiet, especially during the first years after construction was completed. But when researchers began to examine many of these so-called ghost cities more closely, they discovered that the reality was often more complex. Many of these cities that initially appeared almost empty gradually began to fill with residents over the following years. One of the most striking examples is the district of Ordos Kangbashi. When it first began appearing in international news reports, it was often portrayed as a symbol of failed urban planning. Yet, over time, the population of the district steadily grew, and today hundreds of thousands of people live there, with functioning schools, shops, offices, and cultural institutions. This example clearly shows that many new cities in China are not built with the expectation that they will be fully populated immediately after construction is completed. They are designed with decades in mind. In a country where urbanization is still ongoing and where millions of people move to cities every year, infrastructure needs to be ready to accommodate future residents. That is why new cities often appear far too large for the present moment. But gradually, they begin to fulfill the role for which they were originally created. This is where one of the key differences between the Chinese and Western models of urban development becomes visible. In many countries, cities grow organically. First, people and businesses arrive, and infrastructure develops later in response to that demand. In China, the process often works in the opposite direction. First, the infrastructure is created: roads, transportation systems, housing, public spaces, and only after that does the population gradually begin to fill these cities. This is why what might look like an empty city today can transform within 10 or 15 years into a fully functioning urban center with hundreds of thousands of residents. When people look at China's ghost cities only through the lens of empty streets and dark apartment windows, it is easy to conclude that they are the result of economic mistakes or poor planning. But if you look at the situation from a broader perspective, it becomes clear that a different logic is at work, the logic of long-term planning. China is a country where economic and infrastructure decisions are often made not with a time horizon of a few years, but with decades in mind. That is why new cities are built not only for the population that exists today, but also for the people who will move there in the future. Over the coming decades, urbanization in China is unlikely to stop. Even though the overall growth of the population is slowing down, hundreds of millions of people still live in rural areas. Many of them continue to move to cities in search of jobs, education, and better living standards. This means that demand for urban housing and infrastructure will likely remain strong for a long time. In such a situation, a country can either wait until cities become overcrowded and react afterward, or it can build new urban centers in advance in order to avoid chaotic growth. It is precisely this second approach that has become a defining feature of China's development model. New cities, districts, and transportation systems appear long before they become critically necessary. At first glance, this may seem overly ambitious or even wasteful, but from the perspective of long-term planning, it allows the country to avoid many of the problems faced by other nations where infrastructure constantly lags behind the pace of urbanization. As a result, a paradoxical situation emerges. What today appears to be an empty urban space may actually represent only the earliest stage in the life cycle of a city. Many new districts in China go through a similar phase. Construction is completed faster than people move in, but over time, the population gradually grows. Shops open, businesses begin operating, traffic increases, and the city starts to look completely different from how it appeared in the first years after it was built. That is why the concept of ghost cities can often be misleading. It creates the impression that these cities are destined to remain empty, even though many of them gradually evolve into fully functioning urban centers. A photograph of an empty boulevard may look dramatic, but it captures only a brief moment in the much longer history of a city's development. In this sense, the Chinese cities that today seem too large or unusually quiet can be seen as a kind of bet on the future. They represent infrastructure built in advance before it becomes fully necessary. And if urbanization in China continues as many analysts expect, a significant number of these cities may gradually fill with people, transforming from symbols of empty construction into new economic centers. So the real question may not be why China is building cities that appear empty today. The more interesting question is what these cities will look like in 10, 20, or 30 years, when the wave of urbanization finally reaches the spaces that now seem quiet and almost deserted. Only then will it become clear whether these projects were an example of excessive ambition, or, on the contrary, one of the most far-sighted urban strategies of the modern era. However, even if many Chinese cities gradually fill with people over time, the debate surrounding this model of development has not disappeared. Critics point out that the massive construction of cities in China has created not only new infrastructure, but also significant financial risks. For decades, the construction sector has been one of the main drivers of the country's economic growth. And because of this, an enormous system of lending, investment, and debt has formed around it. Developers borrowed heavily to finance new residential projects, local governments raised funds to build infrastructure, and banks and investors expected these projects to generate stable returns. In such a system, any slowdown in the real estate market can have wide economic consequences. If demand for new housing declines, developers face difficulties selling apartments, which makes it harder for them to service their debts and launch new projects. Exactly these kinds of processes have begun to appear in China's construction sector in recent years. Some major companies have run into financial trouble, raising concerns among economists about the stability of a growth model that has relied heavily on construction and real estate. Yet even within this context, it is important to understand that China's urbanization is still not complete. Despite the fact that the country already has hundreds of large cities and megacities, the movement of people from rural areas to urban centers continues. Many regions are still going through stages of economic transformation, where new businesses, transportation corridors, and industrial zones are only beginning to create demand for new urban districts. Moreover, urbanization in China is often connected not only to the growth of existing cities, but also to the creation of entirely new urban clusters. In some cases, this means that new cities are built as part of large regional development strategies. For example, around major megacities, new satellite cities can emerge that absorb part of the population and economic activity, reducing pressure on the central urban core. These cities may appear underpopulated at first, but over time they become integrated into larger economic systems. This approach is also closely tied to how China plans its future economy. In many cases, new cities are built near transportation hubs, high-speed rail lines, ports, or emerging industrial zones. The idea is not simply to create residential areas, but to build entire economic ecosystems where housing, employment, transportation, and social infrastructure develop together. That is why some of these cities may appear excessively large for their initial population. They are designed not only for the residents who live there today, but also for the economic activity that is expected to emerge in the future. If we look at the history of urban development in different countries, we can see that many major urban centers have also gone through periods when their infrastructure seemed oversized for the population at the time. New districts, transportation systems, and industrial zones are often built in anticipation of future growth that has not yet happened. The difference lies mainly in scale. In China, this process is happening so quickly and on such a massive scale that it attracts the attention of the entire world. And that is precisely why China's ghost cities have become such a powerful symbol in international media. They look unusual, almost surreal. Brand new skyscrapers, wide highways, and modern neighborhoods that at first glance appear almost empty. But these images reveal only one part of the story. Behind them lies a far more complex process of economic transformation, urbanization, and long-term strategic planning that has been reshaping the country for decades. And it is this process that will ultimately determine what Chinese cities will look like in the future. If we look at a map of modern China, it becomes clear that this story is not just about individual cities or isolated construction projects. In reality, the country is gradually creating entire urban systems, large economic regions where dozens of cities are connected through transportation networks, industry, and shared labor markets. Within these systems, new cities often play the role of additional centers that help relieve pressure on megacities while creating new points of economic growth. That is why some of them may appear too large or too empty in their early stages of development. They are not designed as isolated settlements, but as parts of larger economic clusters that are expected to evolve over decades. In this logic, infrastructure plays a crucial role. China is rapidly building high-speed rail lines, new highways, ports, and airports that connect cities to one another and form a unified economic network. When a new transportation line links two regions, it can completely reshape economic activity. Companies may open offices in new locations, people may live in one city while working in another, and investment begins flowing into areas that were previously considered peripheral. That is why many new cities are built near these transportation corridors. They are designed as future hubs of economic activity. This approach also helps address the problem of overcrowding in China's largest megacities. Cities such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen have long struggled with extremely high population density, expensive housing, and heavily overloaded infrastructure. Creating new urban centers in surrounding regions allows part of the population and economic activity to spread outward. People can move to these new cities, where housing is more affordable and living conditions are often more modern than in the older districts of major metropolitan areas. Of course, such a strategy does not guarantee that every new city will automatically become successful. History offers many examples of urban projects that failed to meet the expectations of their creators. Some cities may develop more slowly than originally planned, while others may remain sparsely populated longer than economic models predicted. But it is important to understand that similar risks exist in any large infrastructure project, especially when the scale involves millions of people and decades of development. That is why China's ghost cities often become the subject of debate among different analysts. For some, they represent a symbol of excessive construction and potential economic instability. For others, they demonstrate how a country attempts to prepare for the future by building infrastructure before it becomes critically necessary. As is often the case, the truth likely lies somewhere in between. Some projects may indeed turn out to be overly ambitious, while others may gradually evolve into fully functioning urban centers over time. But regardless of how this model is evaluated, one thing remains clear: the scale of urbanization and construction in China is unprecedented in modern history. No other country has built so many new cities, transportation systems, and residential districts within such a short period of time. And that is precisely why Chinese cities that appear quiet and half-empty today may represent only the earliest stage of a much longer process that will shape the country for decades to come. Perhaps many years from now, some of the districts that are today described as ghost cities will look completely different. Streets that now seem far too wide for the small number of cars using them may become busy transportation arteries. Residential neighborhoods where most windows remain dark today may one day be filled with light and life. And at that point, what now seems strange or even illogical may instead appear as part of a large and deliberate strategy aimed at creating a new urban reality for hundreds of millions of people. And that is why the story of China's ghost cities is, in many ways, a story about how a country attempts to manage its own future. Urbanization, infrastructure development, and economic growth are processes that in any nation unfold over decades. In most cases, they evolve somewhat chaotically, reacting to short-term economic incentives, political changes, or demographic shifts. China, however, is trying to make this process more controlled by planning large urban projects in advance and creating space for future economic growth. That is why new cities often appear far too large for today's population. They are designed not merely as places to live, but as complete economic environments where businesses, industry, technology, and transportation can develop together. When the infrastructure already exists, when roads are built, metro systems are operating, and residential complexes are ready, it becomes much easier for companies and residents to move into these areas. In this sense, new cities can be seen as platforms for future economic activity. Of course, such a strategy requires enormous resources. Building new cities means investing in land, materials, engineering systems, and social infrastructure. It also involves financial risks, especially if economic growth slows or demand for housing changes. That is why China's real estate market periodically becomes the subject of international debate and concern. At the same time, however, these projects create a foundation for economic development that may only become visible many years after construction is completed. If we look at the situation in a global context, it becomes clear that China is attempting to solve one of the largest infrastructure challenges of the modern era. In a world where populations continue to concentrate in cities, the question of urbanization becomes central to economic development. Countries that fail to build housing, transportation systems, and utilities quickly enough often face overcrowding, social tensions, and overstretched infrastructure. China, by contrast, is trying to create a surplus of infrastructure so that it can manage these processes in a more predictable way. That is why the Chinese cities that appear quiet or even empty today may represent only the early chapter of a much longer story. Cities do not emerge fully formed in a single moment. They grow, change, and gradually fill with people and businesses over many years. And it is precisely this slow process of development that often remains invisible to outside observers who see only a brief snapshot in the long evolution of a city. In the end, the question of China's ghost cities comes down to one fundamental choice. Is it better to build infrastructure only when it has already become necessary, constantly trying to catch up with the growth of cities? Or is it better to create that infrastructure in advance, even if it means that for some time it will not be used to its full capacity? China has chosen the second path, and that is why its urban landscape often looks so unusual to many people outside the country. Perhaps a few decades from now, some of these cities will remain examples of excessive optimism, but others may evolve into major economic centers that play an important role in the global economy. And if that happens, the story of these empty cities may look very different, not as a symbol of failure, but as one of the most ambitious experiments in planning the future of urban development. In this sense, China's ghost cities are not simply an architectural or economic phenomenon. They are part of a much larger process of national transformation. Over the past few decades, China has effectively been reshaping its own geography, creating new transportation corridors, industrial zones, technological clusters, and urban centers. When looking at a single city that appears underpopulated, it is easy to conclude that the project has failed to meet expectations. But when viewed as part of a larger system, it becomes clear that its real role may only emerge many years after construction is completed. Cities in general have very long life cycles. Many major urban centers that today seem natural and inseparable from the global economy once appeared far too large or overly ambitious for their time. Infrastructure built in advance often seems excessive until economic activity gradually grows into it. That is why, in the history of urban development, there is almost always a period when construction expands faster than real demand. In China's case, this gap between construction and settlement simply appears more dramatic because of the scale involved. When a new district is designed for hundreds of thousands or even millions of residents, the first few years can make it look unusually quiet. But over time, new businesses begin to appear, universities open, technology companies establish offices, and residential neighborhoods gradually fill with people. What once seemed like excessive infrastructure begins to fulfill the purpose for which it was built. At the same time, this strategy creates another interesting effect. When a new city is built almost entirely from scratch, it can be designed according to modern technological and environmental standards. Many new Chinese cities are planned with wide roads, modern public transportation systems, large green spaces, digital infrastructure, and advanced energy systems from the very beginning. This allows them to develop far more efficiently than older cities that were built decades or even centuries ago and must gradually adapt to new technologies over time. That is why some urban planners view China's new cities as a kind of laboratory for the future of urban development. They make it possible to test new approaches to transportation, energy systems, housing design, and the management of urban space. And although not all of these experiments will be equally successful, the sheer scale of these projects makes China one of the most important testing grounds for new models of urbanization. So when we see photographs of wide avenues without cars or residential districts with dark windows, it is important to remember that these images capture only a single moment in the long history of a city's development. Cities are not born fully formed. They grow, change, and gradually fill with life. And that is why what today appears to be a ghost city may, a few decades from now, look like a completely ordinary and vibrant urban center. In the end, China's ghost cities raise an interesting question about how cities should develop in the 21st century. Should cities grow slowly, responding only to existing demand? Or does the future of urbanization lie in building infrastructure in advance, creating space for economic and demographic growth that has not yet occurred? China has chosen the second path. And although this approach sometimes appears unusual or even controversial, it shows how one country is attempting to plan its urban future decades ahead. If we step back and look at the entire story, it becomes clear that China's ghost cities are far more complex than they first appear. Photographs of empty avenues, new skyscrapers with dark windows, and vast residential complexes without people look dramatic. They create the impression that we are witnessing a massive economic mistake or a failure of planning. But when these cities are viewed within the broader context of long-term urbanization, economic transformation, and infrastructure development, the picture begins to look very different. China is a country that has experienced one of the largest urban transformations in human history over just a few decades. Hundreds of millions of people have gradually moved into cities, changing both the structure of the economy and the way people live. To accommodate such a massive population shift, it is necessary to build housing, roads, transportation systems, hospitals, schools, and entire networks of urban infrastructure. And China decided to do this not gradually, reacting to problems after they appear, but in advance, building new cities before they become fully necessary. That is why some of these cities can appear strangely quiet in their early years. The infrastructure is already built. Residential districts are ready, but the population is only beginning to arrive gradually. To an outside observer, this may look like empty space. But for a system that plans development decades ahead, it is simply the early stage in the formation of a new urban center. Of course, this strategy is not without risks. Massive construction projects require enormous investments, and the real estate market can shift with changing economic conditions. Some cities may develop more slowly than expected, and some projects may turn out to be overly ambitious. But even in those cases, these cities remain part of a larger infrastructure system that may only begin to fully function many years after it has been built. And that is precisely why the term ghost cities is often more of a media image than an accurate description of reality. It captures only one moment in the life of a city, the moment when construction has already been completed, but everyday life has not yet fully filled the space. Yet the history of cities is always longer than a single photograph or a single news report. Perhaps in 20 or 30 years, many of the districts that today seem too large or too quiet will look like ordinary urban centers with millions of residents, busy streets, universities, businesses, and technology companies. And at that point, what was once described as ghost cities may be understood very differently as part of one of the most ambitious urban experiments of the modern era. That is why the real question may not be why China is building cities that appear empty today. A far more interesting question is what these places will look like in a few decades, when the wave of urbanization fully reaches the spaces that now seem quiet. Because it is entirely possible that many of these cities are not truly empty. They are simply still waiting for their future.